Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Melinda Smith, and I am the Vice Provost of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and Associate Vice President Research for EDI at the University of Calgary. It is my honor to welcome you to Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Week 2022 at the University of Calgary. The theme for EDI 2022 is From Commitment to Action, Building Equitable Pathways and Futures in the University. Our first keynote today is by Dr. Anne Lopez from OISE, University of Toronto, who will be speaking on the topic of embedding and sustaining equity and decolonial practice in higher education. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Guinea First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki Best-Spore and Wesley First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Today, we are witnessing a renewed urgency for EDI leadership and action. As Rashid Ogunlaru put it, in leadership, life, and all things, it's far wiser to judge people by their deeds than their speech, their track record, rather than their talk. The theme From Commitment to Action, Building Equitable Pathways and Futures in the University reflects our campus's commitment and desire for change. It recognizes that after 3 decades of pursuing employment equity and EDI all across the post-secondary sector, we need an urgent reset to move beyond talk, statements, and commitments to concrete actions to affect systemic and sustainable change. Now more than ever, there's a fierce urgency of now to recall the principle of fairness highlighted by then Judge Rosalie Silva-Mandabella in her final report of the Royal Commission on Equality in Employment in 1985. Abella called for concrete measures, proactive measures to ameliorate inequities because, as she puts it, to quote, "It is not fair that many people in these equity deserving groups, as we call them today, have restricted employment opportunities, limited access to decision-making processes that critically affect them, little public visibility as contributing members of our society and our institutions." So we are gathered in this context also of ongoing racial reckoning and the COVID-19 pandemic, a pandemic which has exposed and aggravated pre-existing inequities and created new ones. There's an urgency, a fierce urgency to take actions to build more equitable pathways and futures in the academy and the broader society for this generation, and also for future generations, the generations to come. Moving from commitment to action requires an understanding of the principles and practices of mutuality. These are embedded, for example, in the Scarborough Charter on Anti-Black Racism and Black Inclusion, which the University of Calgary recently signed. As Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King stressed long ago in Why We Can't Wait, mutuality really is key. As King said then, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. all of us are accountable for this transformation, yet we know that the weight of this change disproportionately falls on those already underrepresented and marginalized, stressing again the urgent need for more equitable pathways and futures. EDI Week at University of Calgary is an annual week-long series of events and activities to raise awareness, expand EDI literacy and education, engage with the campus community and beyond, and how we need to work together to close the knowledge gap, the data gap, the policy gaps, to think together about reimagining and redesigning more equitable campuses. The events are an integral dimension of our efforts to embed equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility in all spheres of the university life, in governance and leadership, admissions, hiring, retention, in teaching, learning, and the classroom experiences, in research, scholarship, community engagement, and throughout living and workspaces of our campuses. Embedding EDI means it cannot be siloed or on the margins. It must be fully integrated, fully woven into who we are, what we do, and how we do it, and whom we do it with. That is, it must reflect the principle of not about us, without us. So this year, the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion has coordinated with units across the entire campus, community lectures, workshops, performances, installations, and other events to deepen the University of Calgary's commitment to EDI, to identify barriers, to develop strategies for ameliorating inequities that impede access to and success within the university, but also across other post-secondary institutions more generally. So today we'll be talking about embedding and sustaining equity and decolonial praxis in higher education, actualizing ProLovePedagogy. Together, we will explore the ways that educators in higher education can embed and sustain equity and decolonial practices in their everyday work that will help to create lasting and sustainable change. It is my distinct pleasure now to introduce to you our keynote speaker for today. We are fortunate to have with us Dr. Ann Lopez, who is a professor of education leadership and policy in the Department of Leadership, Higher Education, and Adult Education at the University of Toronto. Dr. Lopez is also the director of the Center for Leadership and Diversity and the Provostial Advisor on Access Programs. Dr. Lopez is the immediate past president of NAME, the National Association for Multicultural Education. Dr. Lopez's research and teaching focuses on anti-racism education, school leadership across contexts, decolonizing and socially just leadership, issues of equity in education and schooling, and most recently, developing concepts of what she describes as pro-love pedagogy. She has published numerous journal articles, book chapters, and 5 books, including Decolonizing Education Leadership, Alternative Approaches to Leading Schools. She is the recipient of several awards, including the 2020 Award for Distinguished Contribution to Teaching at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Dr. Lopez draws her inspiration and commitment to challenging inequities in education and schooling from her beloved grandmother. Please join me as I turn over the virtual floor to Dr. Ann Lopez, opening keynote. Dr. Lopez.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for that amazing welcome. And welcome everyone into the space. I am happy to be here. It is wonderful to see so many people in the virtual space, and hopefully before too long, we will be in a community face-to-face. So before I begin, let me share my slide with you. And and get into my presentation. Okay, can everyone see that well? So as I've said, I am really honored to be here to share some ideas with you on embedding and sustaining equity and decolonial praxis in higher education, actualizing pro-love pedagogy. Before I start, I would also like to share a land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge the land on which I live, which is the region of Peel, and also the land on which I work in Canada, which is the University of Toronto. The region of Peel is part of the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And for thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land and continue to do so today. I am grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As a descendant of the enslaved, I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge my ancestors who survived the cruel journey from their homeland on the continent of Africa so that I can sit before you today. I'm actually coming to you from Accra, Ghana. I am here on sabbatical at the Education University in Winneba. And so I am grateful to be here on this land, the land of my ancestors. And as I like to say, I am their wildest dreams. And so before I begin my conversation, my talk with you today, it is so important to invite our ancestors into this space. And of course, that's what in many ways decolonizing education is all about. It is honoring our ancestors, it is honoring their knowledge. And as I've said before, and just building on what Dr. Smith said, it is really great to see the University of Calgary taking this initiative, looking at action, and really having those critical conversations. You know, without those critical conversations, we will and actions, we will not move forward. So that is great to see. Now, let me apologize for the images that I'm about to share if they're triggering to anyone. But you know, when Dr. Smith reached out and we talked via email and so on, you know, I then went ahead and submitted the title of my talk to you today, and it was already prepared, and then last week unfolded. And so it caused me to reflect and to think about what is it that we should be having conversations about now in Canada? What are some of the things that we should be having conversations about in higher ed? What are those connections to our current situation with what happens in higher education and the actions that we're thinking of taking? How are all these things interconnected? So I had to go back at my presentation and I had to rethink it in some ways and redo it to reflect in many ways events that have occurred that some have said that they, you know, they do not believe that they would see in Canada. So everyone can, I would imagine, knows what that flag is. It's the Confederate flag. And there are conversations in many places and spaces around that showing up at the convoy this weekend, the convoy as they name it for freedom. I'm not going to spend time today on that convoy, but I am going to, in some ways, connect what is happening in the larger Canadian society to why embedding and sustaining critical equity and decolonial work is so important. We also saw that hateful sign emerging this weekend again. And as you can see, those symbols, those images were taken from Twitter. And again, I apologize if this is triggering to anyone, because I do know that images are triggering and they're painful and they're hurtful. And that's why so many Canadians at dinner tables, on Twitter, talking among friends, talking among ourselves, are having conversations about what does this mean for Canada? What does this mean for education schooling in K to 12? What does it mean for education in higher education? What does that mean? How do we engage in this conversation and in this dialogue? And so some have said, well, they could not believe that they're seeing these symbols in Canada. And some have said, indeed, this is Canada. But I think it's important as I have this talk with you today, that we make those connections. And something that emerged from all of the conversations this weekend, those flags, the swastikas, the desecrating on the tomb of the unknown soldier, and all of the conversations that we're having in our public discourse, because we're having a large Canadian family discourse. But one thing that emerged out of that for me, out of the conversations, was really how much white supremacy and eurocentrism and eurocentricity is undergirding much of what we're seeing. And of course, we know that eurocentrism is an ideology and a way of thinking about life that's grounded in and centers Eurocentric knowledge. And we saw some of that. We saw the signs, we saw the conversations, and outside of our experiences and what happened this weekend, we also know that in education, much of it has been undergirded by Eurocentricity and Eurocentrism. And within that conversation and within that way of thinking and belief, it's a dismissing, it's an undervaluing of other forms of knowledge. You know, it is also very dominant. It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's normalized, it's seen as superior. I am here on the continent of Africa, and when you're here on the continent, I've visited many countries on the continent of Africa, and even though the colonizers might have left in physical ownership of land in a colonial way, their presence is still here, and not just on the continent of Africa, whether we're in Jamaica or in Canada. So Eurocentrism and Eurocentricity has a way of normalizing, has a way of spreading, and we've seen that for hundreds of years. You know, it has become a dominant theory that permeates all aspects of life, whether we're talking about science or arts or culture or beauty. You know, and I could spend a lot of time going on in many ways as a descendant of the enslaved and someone who is a Black woman who for so long had to overcome and decolonize my own mind of what images of beauty are, and disrupt those notions grounded in Eurocentrism, white supremacy, and Eurocentric ways of thinking. So Eurocentricity perpetuates the othering in the forms of racism and other forms of discrimination. And of course, we know that much of this was enacted through colonization, and today perpetuated in many ways. You know, we say coloniality, that is the perpetuation of colonial ways of thinking, and colonization, its forms and practices, and that is still very present in education. And so we have to have these conversations. And so the images from this weekend that we've all seen and that we've all been talking about, to me at least, is a reminder of why this work is so important. And what do I mean by the work? Why it is so important to be naming to be talking about equity in a particular kind of way, to be talking about decolonization and decolonial praxis, and to be thinking about ways that we not just only theorize, but ways that we bring that to action in higher education, and then ask ourselves what that means. So hopefully today I'll be sharing some ideas, and we'll be hearing from you your questions, and we will engage in a conversation, in a dialogue. And so critical equity and decolonial praxis for me is decentering. It is a decentering of eurocentricity. It is a decentering of all of the things that I've just talked about. It doesn't mean that, there is this conversation sometimes when we talk about whiteness and we talk about white supremacy and we talk about eurocentricity and so on, that some folks, white folks, believe that we're taking away their identity. It's not that at all. It's not. It is the systems that are grounded in eurocentricity, grounded in white supremacy that we're talking about. We're also asking and suggesting that white folks begin to think about ways in which they are implicated, but we'll have further conversations on that. So it's a decentering. It means then, what do we bring to the center? If we're decentering, what are we bringing to the center? So when I talk about critical equity and decolonial praxis, I'm seeing it as a recentering. So there's a decentering of eurocentricity and white supremacy, and there is a recentering of knowledge that have been pushed to the margins as a result of eurocentricity, white supremacy, colonization, and other forms of exclusion. And I can give examples of that from my own lived experiences as a child growing up in Jamaica. What I was taught in my former years in the texts, what I wasn't taught. I actually basically received a colonized education because I didn't learn anything about my Black ancestors from Africa. So it's so important to think about then critical equity and decolonial praxis in higher education as a decentering and a recentering. And so we have to ask some questions. What does that mean for the work? What does that mean? Dr. Smith, in her introduction, mentioned that at Calgary, many different departments and areas are engaging in EDI work. Then what in that work, what in those conversations are folks talking about in their particular context that should be decentered and should be recentered? And how does that look on the whole? So my own desire and my own interests in this work, as I've mentioned before, comes from my own upbringing, my own lived experiences as a descendant of the enslaved, and of course, steeped, and enveloped in the love of my grandmother, who really, at a very early age, taught me about social justice. The Jamaican culture is an oral culture. We do a lot of storytelling. Knowledge is passed down from the elders, from the grandmothers, from the grandfathers, to the grandchildren, and so on. And so my desire for decolonized knowledge started very early, as I begin to think about who I am, and that whole questioning sort of got wider and broader when I went to the University of the West Indies and begin to read the work of folks like Walter Rodney and begin to question what I had taken for so long in my former years as the given knowledge. I knew more about wheat growing on the prairies of Canada than I knew about countries in West Africa. So on the screen is a map of Jamaica. to locate myself and my positionality and my interests and my desire and the knowledge that I seek, the knowledge that informs this conversation I'm having with you today. In the middle, that's Paul Bogle. And of course, he's a national hero in Jamaica. He was a slave, a runaway slave, and he fought the colonizers. He had a rebellion. And so that's part of the Jamaican history. To the right is the Taino of Jamaica, the Arawaks. And many people do not know that in Jamaica and many countries in the Caribbean, they were indigenous people to that area, the Tainos. I didn't learn anything about them. All I was taught growing up were that there were Arawak Indians and so on, and all of the deficit narratives surrounding who they were, their cultures, and so on. Many people also do not know or might not know that before the British colonized Jamaica, so did the Spanish. And so much of the history of that island and its indigenous peoples were erased. So that's one aspect. And also my own ancestral knowledge about my ancestors who were taken from the continent of Africa and brought in enslavement to Jamaica were not taught to me. It wasn't taught to my mother or my father or my grandmother or my great-grandmother. As a matter of fact, you know, my aunts and my uncles are still alive in their 80s and 90s. And my aunt would tell me that all she learned about Africa was this picture of this person sort of dressed in a kind of way with a loincloth, and that was about it. Again, deficit narratives around people from the continent of Africa. And so it's a desire. It's not just an organizing concept. It is really to acknowledge and to create and to think about alternative ways of engaging in education. So for me, it's really an important part of my own work. And so as I share with you today some ideas on decolonial practice and decolonizing, it starts with the personal. It starts with decolonizing the mind. And if you get a chance, read the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan who actually wrote the book, Decolonizing the Mind. And he writes about his own education and upbringing in Kenya and how his tribal language was kind of seen as inferior, and all of the struggles that he had with that. But it begins with decolonizing the mind. What is the mindset? How do we think of self? How do we think of what we value as knowledge? As I mentioned earlier, it took me a very long time, just starting with looking at yourself, at loving your features, loving your big nose, loving kinky hair, loving the color of your skin, loving everything about yourself. It begins with self and that decolonizing of the mind. And in decolonizing the mind, it is also that undoing, the undoing of the colonizers' knowledge, that Eurocentric knowledge that has been embedded in not only in the education and in the books, but in the culture, in the ways of doing and believing. So it is what I call creating new reservoirs of knowledge. And maybe it's not creating new, maybe it's bringing forward those reservoirs of knowledge that we know that exists in all of these other spaces, in other cultures, and in the different ways of thinking and doing things. It's bringing to the fore that rich reservoir of knowledge that to inform education. and to inform the way we think of teaching and learning in higher education. And what does that mean? You know, when we think of decolonizing, we think of reimagining curriculum and pedagogy grounded in the knowledge of those who've been oppressed. And you know, many folks have read Frere's work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and really what it means to have pedagogy that emerges, that rises up from those who've been on the margins. It's also a reclaiming that honors Indigenous knowledge, African Indigenous knowledge, all Indigenous knowledges across the globe, and that honors our ancestors and their knowledge. It's also a remembering, you know, drawing on the stories to enrich all aspects of life, including educational life. And as I think of remembering, I'm drawing a lot on the work of Cynthia Dillard, Nana Cynthia Dillard. And she's a scholar who does work here in Ghana, does research in Ghana, and writes about this remembering and what it means for scholars, what it means to her as an educator, what it means to teacher candidates, what it means for educators and scholars and community members to engage in this remembering and drawing on those stories to enrich all aspects of life, but for those of us in educational life as well. And so I borrow this image from Marie Baptiste, Canadian Indigenous scholar. And, you know, she says that we've all been marinated in Eurocentricism. I really, really like that way of putting it, that way of positioning it, because we're all implicated. You know, white folks are implicated, descendants of those from Europe are implicated. You know, all doesn't matter what aspects of our identities. Indigenous folks are implicated, Asian folks are implicated, Black folks are implicated, South Asian folks are implicated, you know, folks with other aspects of identity, ability and disability and so on. We've all been marinated in this kind of knowledge that, as I've said, that centers Eurocentric knowledge, Eurocentric ways of knowing, and pushes all other kinds of knowledge to the margin. And so as I think about critical equity then and decolonizing work, I think it's important for us to name, to disrupt, and to take action. And I like that as well, in the ways in which Dr. Smith and Edie, I work at Calgary, is really engaging in moving beyond the theorizing and engaging in reimagining and thinking about ways to take action. And so it is, at least in my thinking and ways of understanding this, it means, therefore, to name white supremacy and all forms of oppression. We cannot move to action unless we can name what the issues are, unless we can name what it is that we want to disrupt, what it is that we want to decenter. We also must challenge ways in which coloniality is perpetuated in educational policies and practices, and particularly so in higher ed. And what do I mean by that? So let's go look at course outlines, for example. What exactly are on those course outlines in courses taught in higher education? Dr. Smith mentions this Scarborough Charter that many universities and colleges across Canada have signed on to, coming out of University of Toronto, Scarborough, led by Dr. Wisdom Teddy. So that was focused on anti-Black racism, but it also, in that charter, had actions to be taken. And so we have to look at the policies and the practices, the course outline, what is taught, the readings, who is hired, who is not hired, what does tenure look like? Who are the professors, and not just the academic staff, the other staff as well. Who is hired in the finance offices? It's their diversity. How are they included in decision making? You know, so many practices and policies will have to be disrupted and re-examined if we are going to engage in critical equity work and decolonial ways of thinking in higher education. We must also challenge performative work. And what do I mean by that? And I'm sure, Dr. Smith, you know this very well. It is EDI work that stays on the surface. EDI work that is a kumbaya moment. EDI work that some calls comfort equity, window dressing. I sometimes call it laminated equity. It's that performative work where there are nice policies, nicely laminated, nicely put up, but nothing is changing in terms of policies and practices, how students are experiencing education in higher education, how faculty is experiencing the space, how staff are experiencing the space, the community involvement and engagement, and so on. So we have to challenge performative work. We also have to be mindful and know when it is performative work to call it out and to call in so that we can have the real change. We also have to hold folks accountable for the change in the system. We cannot sit and have meetings and talk about what we think must happen, but nothing never happens. There are meetings after meetings after meetings after meetings, copious amounts of notes, copious amounts of consensus building, and all of those things are important. We must build consensus, we must collaborate, but there's got to be a point where we cannot sit in theory only. We have to take theory and bring it towards action, bring it towards praxis. You know, this work is not new. It is not new at all. And so we know that many Canadian scholars have been doing this work. Enid Lee, George Day, Akua Benjamin, who coined the term anti-Black racism, Carl James, and others, to name a few. And in doing this work, we also must name and engage in decolonizing and decolonial education as well. So this critical equity, and I know in many ways, where we are now in 2022, some would argue that equity is a contested term. And the reason why they're saying that it's a contested term is because so many things that have been labeled as equity work really, they've not resulted in much change and sustainable change that you know, folks in higher education can see. And I'll just mention K-12 schooling as well, that students in school can see. And so some people are getting frustrated maybe with equity that's just kind of a let's do some nice feel good things, but we will not name white supremacy, we will not name oppression, we will not make anyone uncomfortable. We will just do a little bit, just enough to keep folks feeling good. So in many ways, at least in my mind anyway, I think we can engage in critical equity. We must engage in critical equity, and we must ask for those actions and really work towards creating those change in policies and practices and so on. So it is what I'm saying here, that it is pushing the margins of EDI work in higher education. It's almost pushing those margins, and it's bringing in from the margins. So it's pushing those margins. It is creating new conversations. It is ensuring that diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's ensuring that it doesn't remain at the surface level. It ensures that there are actions that really create the change in policies and practices. In many ways, the colonizers and colonization left many, many roots. Even after 400 years of enslavement of Black people are still suffering and in many ways experiencing the impact and effect of enslavement and colonization and so on. You know, in many of these, you know, we say former colonies in quote unquotes, you look at who owned the resources, look at how the countries are organized and so on. We still see the perpetuation of some of those ideas. So what I'm suggesting today in this talk is that we have to push EDI, particularly in higher education, to work at the margins and to also bring the margins in. And so decolonial education, therefore, challenges the epistemological foundations of colonialism. It is this delinking from Eurocentric thought. It is therefore this reclaiming and developing non-Western cosmologies and creating space for the expression of different cultures, political and social memories. And this is Mignolo who outlined this. And I think it really is about that. It is this delinking, it is this decentering. It's also a process for community self-determination at moments of materializing spaces of survival and at other times in the spaces of recovery. And Zavela talks about this. And so, you know, we now talk about students should be in spaces where they can survive and thrive. Well, in higher education, what does that look like? What does that mean for students coming into Calgary? What are those processes in place that will help them to survive and thrive and draw on all of the knowledge in their own communities and connections to communities? What does that look like in practice? The other piece of this that Zavela talks about that I really connect with is that the space of recovery, and some would say space of healing, because, you know, oppression creates pain and oppression creates trauma, and being denied, being ripped away from your anchoring knowledge, what I call this anchoring knowledge, the knowledge that anchors you, anchors your identity, and anchors your very being and existence in this world. To be ripped away from that in education and so on does have a negative effect on the soul, on the spirit. And so we have to include, as we're thinking about this decolonial work, the healing, the recovery, and create space for that. And what might that look like? And so decolonial work affirms epistemological diversity, develops knowledge and knowledge systems that have been silenced and colonized. And so in a conceptual way, that's what is a framing. That's the undergirding. That's the undergirding. And then we're going to translate that into action, into praxis. And of course, you know, we're all implicated in the decolonizing process. It's not we have our own individual work to do, but we're all implicated as educators, as professors, as community members, is whatever our location is, we are all implicated. You know, because I think it's Marie Batiste that says, at some point, we've all experienced education, and as she said, as I showed before, we've all been marinated in eurocentricity. And so as Marie Batiste says, we must all become learners and healers within a wounded space. And I think that wounded space that Professor Marie Batiste is talking about is education and other aspects. You know, it's not just education, it's all aspects of society impacted by colonization, impacted by eurocentricity, impacted by white supremacy. And if we could connect back to what we've been seeing this weekend, There's so many people expressing wounding of the soul, feeling hurt, feeling upset. And before I go deeper into some of the strategies, we also have to be very careful of sort of using decolonizing as a buzzword. You know, it's decolonizing this, and we're going to decolonize that, and we're going to do these things, but not stopping and taking the time to really excavate and understand what it is all about. And of course, if decolonizing and decolonial work is sort of named in EDI work, but not gone into deeply, not understood, then we run the risk of creating further harm and further damage. So we also have to be very careful, because there's a way in which in today's world that is very easy to appropriate terms and to put words onto things without the deep meaning. And so as I transition in this talk with you today around, you know, what then are some of the practical things that we can do? What are some of the things that we can do in higher education? I've talked about, it starts with self and decolonizing the mind, and each person has to do that journey. Each person has to do that work. I had to do my own work, had to do my own journey, and I'm still on a path of my own decolonizing of the mind, on doing all of that colonial education that I talked about earlier. And I think, you know, this is from Queno and others, who talks about that education is a site of struggle. And is that ever true today in 2022? We look at the United States, we look here at Canada. What are the conversations happening? It's all about education. It's all about, well, kids need to be back at school. And when people hear that, different people hear different things. Different folks understand it differently. And there is a really rich dialogue happening on that front. If we look at the United States, where people are turning up at school board meetings to see who is elected to the school board. Once, you know, mundane school board elections have now become this battle, the banning of books, the attack on critical race theory. And so we now know that it's not just an organizing concept, that when we say education is a site of struggle, the struggle is happening right before our very eyes. And so it is also happening in higher education. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean in higher education? When we say education is a site of struggle, what is the struggle in higher education about? And I've mentioned earlier, you know, how students experience the space. One of the things that came out of the University of Toronto's task force on anti-Black racism, it was about all of the experiences that students had with different spaces. But they also talked about going into classes and feeling traumatized by the very discussion, feeling traumatized by the lack of work or the lack of readings and materials that reflect their history, their knowledge, and so on. And I'm sure that is also for others as well. And so what questions then must be asked? And so how do scholars and students then respond to what Queno calls the coloniality of power? So if we are going to embed and sustain critical equity and decolonial practice in higher ed, these questions must be asked in the different spaces. And not just in the humanities. What questions are being asked in the science labs? If we were to walk into the science lab in higher ed, who would we see? Who are the professors? Who are the students being admitted? Who is there? Who isn't there? And why are they not there? And what plans are there to ensure that those spaces have other kinds of knowledge coming into the discourse that happens in those spaces? So we have to engage in dialogue and reflection in the Freirean tradition of critical consciousness and liberatory education. And as I've said again, not just sitting only in theory, but asking ourselves, what does this mean in spaces? And I should say here that those spaces are just not sort of this generic space. Its space is going to be a little bit different, and those questions will have to be reimagined and be reconceptualized. So that is how we get to the embedding and the sustaining. It is to ask those questions and then think of the practice. Think of what has to change, what policies and practices must be changed, need to change. And as I've said before, who is going to be held accountable? That also must be there as well. And so drawing on the work of Zavala, he suggests that decolonial praxis involves these three things, and I'd like to share them with you today. Naming and remembering, that is the counter storytelling. It is the naming of what the form of oppression is, but naming coloniality, naming it, and also it's the remembering of alternative ways of thinking. It is creating that space for other forms of knowledge to enter. And so in critical race theory, we talk about the counter narratives, and those counter narratives, they're called counter narratives because they're the narratives that is sitting in opposition to the narratives of white supremacy, to the narratives of Eurocentric knowledge, to counter to the narratives that will be given all of our lives. They also suggest that there must be space for healing. What does this space look like? And as I've mentioned before, you know, this space for healing might be in a department. And it's what space is created so that students can feel comfortable enough to share their stories, or to share when they're feeling traumatized. What does that look like? That's the action. And then out of that, we create that lasting change in the space. And so, you know, I have to have some conversations about what this healing looks like. And in all of this work, you know, I believe, anyway, in my own work, that it's going to take some time. It's not a one, we do it one day and we're over. It's going to take some time. And of course, Zavala says there must be reclaiming practices, reclaiming of the practices, reclaiming of the identities, reclaiming of the spaces. You know, I can use myself as a professor teaching a course now called Decolonizing Educational Leadership. And for me, that was an aspect of practice in my own department to ensure that we had a course on decolonizing educational leadership. But I couldn't say, well, somebody has to do this. I had to take the agency to work towards that collaboratively, but there also has to be some agency. And then, of course, when we're in the classes and in the spaces, what is that conversation like? How do folks begin comfortable reading materials and so on, grounded not in the traditional educational leadership discourse that's in a particular way and in a particular area. So there has to be some, what Zavala says, as reclaiming. So we have to ask the big question: what does this looks like and feels like in higher education spaces? So what I'm suggesting is that as we're naming and remembering, as we're creating these spaces for healing, as we're reclaiming, begin to ask, okay, what does this look like? Because people have to be able to see it. We have to be able to feel these things. You know, we can't just pontificate about change. You know, we can't sort of talk all day long about liberation and justice. We have to explain and help people to understand, what does this mean for them? What does this mean for their daily existence in higher education spaces? What will be different? And so I think it is very important. And you know, the work, as I said, there's going to be agency, but there has to be a collective, there has to be collaboration and so on. But we have to ask the questions and we have to ensure that we have the practice to go along with the ideas. And so as I come towards the end of this presentation, I want to leave with you some ideas that I've sort of created over the years to do this, that I suggest that we work with and through tensions. It means that we're going to have to navigate the space. So we have to disrupt while we're literally, sustaining. So if something good is happening, we're going to take that as a win and work with that. But while we're, enjoying the win, we also have to acknowledge other tensions in the space. So we have to really take Calgary, for example, and other universities. These are big institutions that many of them are sitting in tradition for a long time. So as we work through those things and try to bring into the space the naming, the remembering, the reclaiming, we have to work through the tensions that will arise and acknowledge those. So we have to sustain and we have to stay. It means we have to create those actions and policies that will sustain us and that will, so that we can stay the journey. That's what I'm suggesting as sustaining and staying. It is doing the work, but we also have to take care of ourselves and take care of each other. And of course, I talked about the critical ideology, particularly around EDI work, that it doesn't sit at the performative level, but that it challenges white supremacy, all forms of oppression, name it, and so on. And of course, I believe that there's ongoing learning, unlearning, and relearning, because we are always in a state of learning, but we also have to unlearn the ways and thinking and doing of coloniality. When we think of students, when we think of student success, what does that mean? What exactly is student success? How do we support students? What does support look like? What does support mean? All of those questions in higher education must be asked. And so we have to maybe unlearn some of the old ways and relearn new ways grounded in this critical equity and this decolonial way of thinking, particularly as, of course, we're having a great diverse student body. And I just want to say here that this work is not just for Black, Indigenous, Asian, South Asians, diverse people. It's also for students who self-identify as white. Because when we move the system forward for Indigenous and Black and racialized people, we move it forward for everyone. And that's important. It's not an us versus them. It's an all of us together, but it's an all of us together recentering new forms of knowledge, new ways of thinking. And so all of this I'm suggesting will be done through what I call, and I'm writing about now, pro-love pedagogy. I was tired of anti this and anti that, and it's very important to have, what are we pro? Because anti-racist education, anti-oppressive education, decolonizing, equity work is about love. If we dehumanize someone, then it gives us permission to hate them. And so, as the late Bell Hooks says, the moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action is the testimony of love as the practice of freedom. We educators, we love our students. We hurt when they hurt. But love, this kind of love is the kind of love that centers the humanity and it really names forms of oppression, because we cannot love if we oppress, and so on. And it is this pro-love pedagogy that really centers love and really centers this seeing each other as worthy, seeing each other as worthy of love, of worthy of care, of worthy of being able to survive and thrive. And that means creating spaces free from oppression, creating spaces where we can build our knowledge. And so it creates space for healing, as I've said, where people can thrive. It's a pedagogy that centers freedom, liberation, and justice. It affirms ways of working across difference. You know, it's not a black-white binary. We also have to understand intra-diversity. How do we do that? You know, we saw after the murder of George Floyd, this amazing cross-racial solidarity of different people. And some are saying that in many ways, what we're seeing today across the United States and Canada is a reaction to all of that cross-racial solidarity that's grounded in love for our fellow human beings. This work does not perpetuate spirit injury. It doesn't dehumanize while doing the work. And so in those spaces of healing, it is truly a space of healing. It's not a space of re-injuring. And so hopefully, as we walk away and we try to take up some of this, we begin to ask those questions in our own context as we begin to engage in this work so that we can embed and we can sustain. So it doesn't feel like we're going on and off the treadmill all the time, but we're constantly building. We're constantly building, and we must have that lasting change. Because, you know, people say they're exhausted. We're exhausted and tired because we're constantly doing the work over and over and over again. You know, celebration and joy brings energy. And so we need to have that. We need to have the lasting, sustainable change. We really need to have that foundation for our students. And so I believe that it's necessary and important if critical equity and decolonial practices are to be sustained and have this lasting change, we have to engage in what I call pro-love pedagogy, embedding all of the ideas and points that I've shared. So in concluding, I say it is a journey of learning, unlearning, and relearning, sort of closing the loop. As we say, when we deconstruct, we must reconstruct. So as I close with you today, I want to close that loop. I want to invite you into the conversation, into the dialogue, into the space where we're all going to reimagine a new world that decenters eurocentricity, decenters coloniality, decenters and recenters all of our knowledge that's been at the margin, ways of thinking and doing, and brings that into praxis. So thank you in many different ways. The thank you is Jamaican patois. Hope you can see your own way of thank you. All of these down here, some of them are from the continent of Africa. So again, thank you for this opportunity. I truly appreciate.
Dr. Lopez, thank you for that fantastic opening keynote to EDI Week here at University of Calgary. We greatly appreciate the full content of the journey, the intellectual journey, the practical journey, the policy journey, the curriculum journey that you just took us on. So before I turn the floor over to the questions, so I would encourage the audience to put their questions in the Q&A. But I'd like to actually open up with a question, and my colleague, who is Dr. Aruna Srivastava, might also have some questions for you. I want to actually, you started with this, what I think is also a knowledge gap, which is the events that are unfolding in real time related to discussions around white supremacy, but also discussions around the re-emergence of the Nazi, the swastika associated with genocide, and the re-emergence of, in Canada, of the Confederate flag. Now, we would normally in Canadian education, these things are disassociated with Canada. They are seen as things elsewhere that happen elsewhere. So I'm trying, so I wonder if you would want to flesh out a little bit more this idea that those things happen elsewhere. They're not relevant to Canada. They don't happen here. They're not about us. And if that's true, how is it that we do not understand even the histories of racism and segregation and slavery and colonialism here, such that they are happening in this moment, and we think they are not about who we are. So how is that connected to K-12, but also to what we learn or don't, or the silences in our classrooms and in education? So I wonder if you could take a few minutes to talk about that.
And thank you for that, because I think that is as a direct result of what is not taught in K-12 schools, what's been missing in the education system. And, you know, there's a way in which in Canada for a long time, we sort of believed that those things happen elsewhere, but actually that's not true. And many folks who've been doing this work for a long time have said that, you know, Canada needs to come to terms with its racist past, that those of us in Canada, we cannot continue to sort of plaster over using multiculturalism as a way of ignoring the racism that exists in the society, as a way of not teaching the history, as a way of not teaching some of the things that have happened in Canada. And so we are here today, and I think we've arrived at a point in this country where we're going to have to ask ourselves, what exactly are we teaching in K-12? What exactly are we teaching in history? What exactly are we teaching in social studies? What does that look like? And I think in many ways, this weekend and what is happening has what I call shaken the myth that has been perpetuated for a long time. And we believed it. Many people believed it, that, you know, that these things are not happening. And many scholars have been writing about it for a long time, that you know, we get to February and we celebrate Black history in a very kind of, in some spaces in real ways, in some spaces in superficial ways. But Dr. Smith, it really speaks to what has been missing from the education curriculum. And even if it's there, in what depth is it there? What are the examples? What are students learning in school, and how it's taught, so that they do not grow up believing that all is okay and we're just having this great, you know, sort of kumbaya moment. So it's really what has been missing, I should say, in our K-12, and holding higher ed accountable, Dr. Smith. It's also in many ways, what are the courses? What are the universities courses teaching? Again, in some of those courses, in many universities, you don't get this kind of dialogue unless you're taking a particular professor's course, or you're in a particular department, you know, where that kind of knowledge is highlighted. It's not kind of seen as a norm. So, and finally, we have to normalize now this kind of history. We have to really go back and ensure that all of what's been missing about Indigenous people, the genocide, Canada's role in enslavement, all of that must now be part of the curriculum in many ways. So we have to insist on that.
So I greatly appreciate that conversation about curriculum, pedagogy, and I know that there are a lot of people who have questions. And so I'm gonna, and they're coming in, so I'm gonna try and cut off of my questions and talk to you at another time. But Derek, so I'm just gonna go to the audience. Derek Mason, for example, wants to know if you can spend more time just teasing a bit about the implications of this language of decolonization, or decolonizing educational leadership. Now, you're very clear that you're not interested in decolonization as a metaphor, or decolonization for all the language of social justice, as your colleague Eve Tuck writes about. So when you use the language of decolonizing in educational leadership, what do you see as the biggest challenges? What do you see as the resistances, and what do you think of, how is it administration shaped by Eurocentric policies and practices that also need to be transformed?
So in terms of decolonizing educational leadership, For a long time, the field of ed leadership was really dominated by white men, their scholarship, their research. I think it's Dimmock and Walker says, they said this in 2000, and in so many ways it's still true now, that the discourse and the knowledge production in ed leadership was really done by just mainly North American scholars. It was about 7%, they say, of the world population kind of creating knowledge and theories for the rest of the world. So that is something that you will see in ed leadership. It's only in the last, I would say, maybe 20 years or so that we're getting other ways of thinking about ed leadership, social justice leadership, culturally responsive leadership, and now we're talking about decolonizing leadership. So the field itself has a history of really being dominated by white men, their scholarship, their knowledge, and so on. So what does it mean in terms of then the implications? It means, one, acknowledging that history. Two, it also means now looking within educational leadership. And if we sort of bring it down to practice, let us take schools, for example, because school education leadership is K-12 school leadership and higher ed leadership. Let us say take for K-12 school leadership. It's really saying to those who are running schools, you have to begin to look at those practices and policies, whether it be attendance, whether it be exams, whether it be, if you take, not just in Canada, but if you take some countries, I've just completed research in Jamaica and Kenya and in Toronto, and I'm here in Ghana now, just getting ready to embark on research with school heads here. And it is really how exam is used to separate out the students. So, and again, all of that has to do with access and resources. And a lot of these practices have been left behind by the colonizers. And so that has to be named in sort of teasing this out in leadership. We also have to look at the knowledge that is dominating. Again, when we have, let us get, and I'm taking this deep dive now, principal preparation courses. What are those aspiring leaders reading? What are they walking away believing that the work is about? What is it that we're sort of training them to do? What is the knowledge that's undergirding this? So in decolonizing work, it is saying that all of this, eurocentricity, white supremacy, all of that must be decentered. So you have to literally look at the readings, look at the policy manuals, look at the leadership frameworks, whose knowledge is here, whose knowledge is not here, and begin to literally redo some of these frameworks and things. Now, that in a decolonizing way that decenters whiteness, decenters that knowledge, and begin to bring in other kinds of knowledge to inform what leadership looks like. What exactly does that mean? What does the work look? What does it look like then when we engage with community? What does that look like? How do we disrupt those narratives and those deficit relationships and so on? So that is what it means in practice in terms of ed leadership. Also suggest in my work and in my book that school leaders in doing decolonial work must also think about themselves. They also have to engage in this deep reflexivity, this deep sort of decolonizing their own mind. So there's also a self-agency as well that is implicated in this work.
So Dr. Aruna Shrivastava has a question for you. Aruna, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I apologize. I've never had this happen in Zoom before where the camera doesn't work. So my question, I was thinking about your expression, laminated equity, and I love it. I'm going to use it a lot. But I want to bring that to myself and be a bit self-reflexive, because I've been sharing a story with students in my graduate class about how difficult it was to recreate my course outline according to universal design principles, and how hard that is given the course outline templates and requirements that we at our university have. And so I think my question is, how do we respect and honor the labor of any of us who are trying to, and I think this gets back to Derek Mason's question too, who are trying even in very uneven ways to engage in equity and accessibility, let alone critical equity.
So first of all, thank you. So before I answer the second part, Aruna, I hope I got the pronunciation of your name correct. Let me just quickly say something about laminated equity. That term came out of my own experience. I've been an educator now for going on 30 years. And I watched so many equity and inclusive projects over the years, just literally arrive in schools and stay in boxes while, behind the secretary or the whomever, there's this nicely laminated thing about all the things that they stand for, none of which were happening. And I was like, oh my goodness, they've just laminated it, put it up, and keep on moving. So it really dawned on me, oh, that's what is happening. So that's where that whole term laminated equity came from, and I've written about it. I can send you someplace, an article that I teased it out a little bit more. And so it dawned on me. So that was the laminated piece, because everybody thought they were doing it by just, those were the days when they would put the thing and make it warm and put it in the thing and it was up and nicely displayed. The other piece of that about the laminated equity, I would watch school leaders use the laminated thing that was on the wall to perpetuate oppression against parents. So you can use it as a policy when you want to really double up on the discipline that you're going to give, grounded in racism and stereotypes. You can point to the policy, but beyond that, there will be nothing affirming. So that was how that came about. In terms of respect and honor the labor, that's what I refer to as the sustain and stay. Because I think it's really important to recognize that people don't just wake up one day and we're all imbued with this knowledge and we're ready to go. We have to learn and unlearn. I'm still on the journey of unlearning my colonial education and watch for where I might have, ideas that constantly reflecting. So that is so very important in terms of how we do this work. We have to create that space. I think that is the space creation, what I call the sustain and stay. Create the space where people can labor, where they can wrestle with the tension, but we're not creating spirit injury. So we have to, we some people call it call out and call in, but I think there has to be that genuine effort of building those relationships. This work does not happen outside of relationships. No one person can do it alone. It has to be a collective effort, even though we might be drawing on our own agency and work and so on. It has to be a collective effort. And so that's what I mean by the sustain and stay, working through the tensions. We have to acknowledge what people are doing and their best faith efforts, even though they might not be enough. And so to give a practical example quickly, in those spaces, we might say, we honor what you're doing, but what else can we do? I like to use the questioning approach. Say, okay, but I think we might need to do something more. How can we do that? What supports you might need? And going back to leadership, that's where the leadership also comes in. So we have to have that space.
So you have thank you very much, Aruna. So you have quite a few questions. A cluster of them are related to, they want to hear more about your pedagogy. What does that, and one question is ProLove, what does ProLove pedagogy look like on the ground in teaching and learning methods and delivery? And how can that be embedded more fulsomely in higher education. And another question is, could you provide a definition of love? And I know that's volumes of that you can work on, and you only have so many minutes, but I'll just put that there. And a third question, and so you can answer them, and relates to how much time should we spend on undoing and dismantling and the D side of things? And how much, and should we be investing more energy on reconceptualizing, reimagining, redoing, and rebuilding radical alternatives that center love? So you are asked to talk a lot about love.
Okay, so so when we go to the definitions of love, I'm just going to quickly say, just read bell hooks, and just go from there. That's the version of love where she talks about love that's liberatory love. So it's not this. So, and how did I sort of come up on and pro-love and where I'm going with this? It's, we have to, and I am, of course, you all know I'm grounded in K-12 in many ways, and we have to love students and not dehumanize them, so that we do not oppress them, so that they do not feel oppressed. So that's the kind of pro-love. It is really creating that space where students not only feel they belong, but they can survive and thrive. Now, how do we survive and thrive as human beings, as students in a space? We survive and thrive when we feel we're being heard. We survive and thrive when we do not have spirit injury. I write a lot about, this whole thing about resiliency, and students must be resilient, and a whole cottage industry on resiliency. Well, we should not be asking students to be resilient in the face of oppression. The system must change. The oppressive practices must change. So that's the kind of love. And it means that we want to see students thrive. We want to see them do well, be their best selves without feeling that their souls, their bodies, their very being is being traumatized, because oppression hurts. It doesn't matter whether it's ableism, homophobia, Islamophobia, whatever it may be, it hurts. And so that's what I mean by pro-love pedagogy. It's taking away the hurt and pain that sometimes happen through educational policies and practices, teaching, learning, and leadership. As a Black woman, I can tell you that my soul has been hurt. I cannot tell you how often and how many times. I am a grandmother. My granddaughters' souls have been hurt in K-12 school when they come home and say, Grammy. So pro-love pedagogy means the absence of oppression. It means the absence of that soul-hurting thing that comes from being marginalized. In terms of the time spent on the D part, dismantling, and then on the other side, reconceptualizing, I am going to say that these things are, so number of things. I think they go hand in hand. I think that while you're reconceptualizing, I do not see these things as fixed constructs. I see them as fluid. And also sometimes contextual. What might need to be dismantled and reconceptualized might look differently at U Calgary than it does at U of T, depending where things are, depending on the resources, depending on the people that you're working with, depending on the time and effort, depending on the leader, and all of those things. And so, but what I would say, and this is drawing on my own experience, I will not go into spaces now when all we're going to do is talk. I think we've talked long and hard about equity and all of these things. I will only go into spaces when we say, okay, we're going to talk, but what exactly are we going to do? And what does the doing look like? So we need both the theorizing and we need the practice. So I would say to that person who asked that question, they go hand in hand. And in terms of time, I think the time is contextual. Because I guess I say, it might take less time at U Calgary than it might be at USAS or U of T and so on and so forth. But one quick last thing I would say on that, the dismantling and the reconceptualizing must never be never ending. There must be, okay, we shall do this by the end of term 1. And then there has to be accountability. We're going to do this by the end of year 2. So there must be a plan, what I sometimes call a journey plan. There has to be a plan of when and how this is going to be done. If not, we talk forever. And we know this has been happening in education for a long time. In Ontario, we had the 1992 report around anti-Black racism. And this is, how many years later in 2022, we're talking about it and still fighting for some of those things to happen. So we have to be careful in spaces where talk doesn't become performative. So yes, I would say that is contextual, but it's not limitless, because trauma and hurt, we can't afford to have students sitting in pain, trauma, and hurt while we're taking our time.
So there are a number of questions about this issue of time, and also time in relation to energy, in terms of the people doing the work, and the toll that the work takes, and including when you're constructed through, for deficit thinking, what I refer to as this perpetual tyranny of low expectation, grounded in these histories of enslavement, colonialism, and marginality. So in the context in which we work, how does one, there is a kind of a set of questions about where does one begin with embarking on this journey in ways that are attentive to this not burning out, attentive to the ways in which this, what you call it, the diversity tax and all these kinds of things take a toll, so that you can focus on love, focus on empathy, and focus on the humanity while not losing your own humanity. So if you could kind of, again, this gets you back to your kind of bell hooks and love, but also Paulo Freire and those kinds of books.
So first of all, I think we've learned that a tired person cannot do anything. An exhausted person cannot do anything. And I think we must take that into account. We're human beings. We have to do all of this while raising families, while going to the supermarket, while managing our finances, while managing our budgets. We're not like living in these sort of bubbles of life. We have to do life as we're doing all of these. So I think it's very important to also acknowledge our capacity, to acknowledge we also have to guard energy. And some people say it's not so much your time you have to guard, it's your energy. So let me give an example. So let us say you're at a university and you're doing this work, you've been tasked to do some things, or you've taken on the agency and you're doing some things. I mentor folks against going into spaces where there are people in those spaces who have no interest in moving along. They have no interest in changing anything. They have no interest in shifting. They are simply there to terrorize your spirit. And they hone it. And so I say, step out of those spaces, step away from it. If we exhaust ourselves and we're not here, the work can't be done. So I think it's very important to guard our energy, to know the spaces that we're in, to know when it's becoming spirit injury, to step away from it. So that is what I would say. The second thing is, I think for many, sort of Black, Indigenous, people of color and so on, we oftentimes find ourselves in these spaces doing the work because we have the interest and we want to see it moving, and we do it. But we must also remind folks that we are not doing this work simply because of our racialization. We're doing it because we have knowledge and skills. That's another thing too, that's a myth that must be demystified, that, when Black people show up to take leadership roles, we're there because we bring Black knowledge and Black experience, but we also bring knowledge and skills that in these spaces, we have to ensure that we're listened to, that knowledge and skill is valued, that our leadership is respected, So all of those things is what happens in the space. What are the conversations? What are the discourses? What are the resources that you're given? My grandmother told me, and do not let anybody give you a basket to carry water, because it will leak on you. So when you're taking on that job, make sure you're not having a basket of equity, a leaky basket of equity, leaking water. So you're just carrying the load, but you're going nowhere. So all of those things are important. What resources do you have? What supports do you have? Guard your energy. I always say, take rest. Take rest. Pause, breathe, and take rest. You know, we are not going to undo 400 years of the hurt and harm of enslavement in a one semester. So take rest so that the work can be sustained. And sometimes go for help. Go say to somebody, I cannot do this alone. And I will not, because I will not allow it to kill me. So we also have to know what our capacity is. Because as I say to folks, we're not equity widgets, we're equity people. And so we must take care.
Not equity widgets. We don't want to be the leaky basket. Brilliant insights. I appreciate the metaphor. Unfortunately, I hope you appreciate all the comments in the Q&A, which highlight how brilliant people thought that presentation was and how appreciative they are. And I am deeply appreciative that you were checking into us from Ghana, where I wish I was also. Thank you for your wisdom, Dr. Lopez, your insight, your humanity. Thank you to our participants for attending, for your questions, for your curiosity, for your commitment to continuing this journey in a meaningful way. And to all of you who were here with us today, thank you for joining. If you're looking for more of the EDI Week, visit our website at ucalgary.ca/equity-diversity-inclusion. Please look for the link for EDI Week under news and events for more information as well. There are additional events this afternoon and throughout the week, including our EDI awards on Wednesday and as well. We appreciate your participation and for taking the time to join us in this very important set of questions that we have had. Thank you and have a good rest of your day. Thank you, Dr. Lopez, and thank you to the audience. Have a good day.
Thank you.